Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you this evening. My name is Lenara Davidson Greenidge, and I am the Associate Dean for Communication Strategy Development and Alumni Affairs. And welcome to our first Hour with the Dean for this academic calendar year. I have the great pleasure of introducing our dean this evening. Dean Melissa Begg joined the Columbia School of Social Work in 2019 as the 18th dean of our school, and we are delighted to welcome her on stage now. Dean Begg.
Thank you, Lenara, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm glad you're able to join us today because we're going to have a fascinating conversation with a wonderful colleague and a cherished member of our faculty, Dr. Ronald Mincy. Dr. Mincy is the Maurice V. Russell Professor of Social Policy and Social Work Practice here at CSSW. He's also the director of the Center for Research on Fathers, Children, and Family Wellbeing. He's co-principal investigator of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study and a member of the Columbia Population Research Center. Dr. Mincy received his BA from Harvard and his PhD from MIT in economics. He's renowned for his groundbreaking conceptualizations and perspectives on some of our nation's most challenging social concerns. He has created, conceptualized, and advanced the development of research on so-called fragile families, disadvantaged families with low-income fathers. He's been a leader in calling attention to the plight of young Black men and other vulnerable populations. Dr. Mincy is the author of numerous articles and book chapters and editor of the book Black Males Left Behind, and he's going to tell us about his new book coming out this evening. Now, through his work, he has catalyzed changes in the treatment of men and boys of color and low-income fathers by U.S. welfare, child support, and family support systems. Over the course of his career, Dr. Mincy has served on leading advisory boards and councils, including the National Poverty Center at the University of Michigan, the Transition to Fatherhood Project at Cornell, and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at NIH. He has been widely recognized for his influence on social policy. And in fact, in 2021, the Society for Social Work and Research presented him with the Social Policy Researcher Award, which honors distinguished researchers who've made outstanding contributions to social policy at the local, national, or international level. Ron, thank you for joining us today. These conversations with faculty are always super interesting and great fun, and I'm grateful for your time.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to just chat with you and our alumni.
Of course, of course. So, Ron, I'm going to start, let's begin at the beginning. You've done decades of terrific work in this area. What first brought you to this research focus?
Well, when I was 18 years old, I wanted to be a lawyer. And I worked for the New York City Neighborhood Youth Court, and my placement was at the family court on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. I didn't have anyone in my family or extended family who was a lawyer, so I wanted to know what it was to be a lawyer. And so I got the job. I was able to, my assignment was to go into the files, take the cases, and make sure the judges had them in the morning before they met. And then in the evening, I would take them, I would transcribe the judge's orders, put them back in the file, and refile the orders. And so that went along well for most of the summer. And then it dawned on me that my mother's case was in the file. And so I had this like awful guilt experience of slowly moving over to the files and moving to the M's and moving to the MI's and the ends, and eventually I found my mother's case, which was like 4 inches thick. And I, snuck in there and I read my family history in ways that I had never understood, and I was furious. I was furious about the things that the relationship between my parents, but I was also furious about the way in which the system treated them. And as this tender 17, 18-year-old, I said, I'm going to fix this. And I spent the last half century trying to do exactly that.
Wow. I can't imagine what that must have been like.
It was something, but
yeah.
But I'm grateful for that that motivation. It never left me, and I'm pleased with the result. And it's the experience of boys growing up without their fathers is one that's that we now quite understand is quite common in communities of color, particularly African American communities. And so I just came committed to the idea that it was really my purpose. I eventually came to a place of forgiving my own father. And I wanted that sort of redemption for lots of Black men who have this experience. And so I just tried to create the science and interact with policymakers around this issue, and saw it in a way that was different than many experts who were operating in the field at the time.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around that, and having that experience as a 17, 18-year-old, and what that motivated in you. That's incredible. Never heard that before. Thank you for saying that. So building on that, if you could write a mission statement for this research agenda that you've pursued, what would that be?
That mission statement would be all about redeeming non-resident fathers, because in the work, there was this famous article book published in the 1980s, and it was called Deadbeat Dads. And essentially it proliferated the idea that men who don't take financial responsibility for their children are they're social pariahs. And that was what I think that view was widely proliferated. I now understand, sort of having read the history of child support enforcement policy, it really was an overlay of the experience of men who marry and have children after having completed school, after having mature relationships in the first place, and then something happens and couples separate, and out of the view that sort of men leave their families and take their money with them. And this is not really the way in which many Black families experience family separation. And so my mission statement would be all about redeeming men who move away from their families, or not able to support their families, redeeming them back into communities, redeeming them back into the culture. It was all about just spreading and understanding that this was really an intergenerational experience among so many men of color, to help so many men and their children have the experience of giving birth to kids, seeing them develop fully, contributing to their development, so that they could be whole people. So I grew up in a household in which I had only brothers and only sons. And so, in my view of the world was very much influenced by the notion that that at every point, at every man at some point, male at some point, is vulnerable and needs the support of families around him, of people who love them and care for them. And just growing up in a household of boys and raising only boys, that became very apparent to me. And I wanted, the transition of boys to men to be one that displayed forgiveness and support, so that men could do the things that they needed to do for themselves and also for the people who they depended upon them. It's all about redemption. That's what motivated. That's the mission statement in a way.
Beautifully said, and counters a lot of, like you're saying, these narratives that have been propagated and fueled for a long period of time, but don't have the data behind them, I think. So as anyone pursues a rich research agenda, some surprises occur along the way. I'm just wondering, what were some of the biggest surprises you've encountered in pursuing the research you've done?
Well, I think the biggest surprise that sort of came out over the course of this work is that this issue of separating from families, not having the economic wherewithal to support families, and maturing and then losing contact with your children. For most of my student and graduate student experience, we thought about and understood this in terms of what was happening to Black men and Black and Latino men. But the thing that is surprising as a consequence of the data that we were able to collect in fragile families is that this is becoming a normative experience for lots of white men as well, because we experience a long-term trend of the decline in earnings of men who have less than 4 years of college, and an increasing incarceration rates among men, white and Black, but much more among Blacks. But increasingly, there's this displacement of white men from high-paying jobs because they don't have a 4-year degree. And as a result, they cohabit instead of marry. And when they cohabit within 3 to 5 years of the birth of their child, the couples break up, and so they become separated from their families. But they also lack the economic resources once they enter the child support enforcement system to pay the child support that they owe. And so in a way, I look at this problem very much like the drug problem. I mean, you know, when I was growing up, we looked at the drug problem mainly as something that existed in communities of color. The opioid addiction has really changed that and changed the way the public views that. It's now, you know, a public health problem. And I see this as very much the same issue in terms of children being separated from their fathers, the child support enforcement system imposing financial responsibilities that they should fill, let me be clear, but they're unable to do so, and the mental health and other sorts of issues that arise because of that, and potentially an intergenerational trend in which more children who grow up whose fathers are low skilled, repeating this cycle because of changes in the way we do family in the United States. This was a real surprise to me, but because we've collected data on this that wasn't available when I was coming up, it's very clear that this is a quite general phenomena. That and because it's a more general phenomena, I think my sense of it is the appetite of the public to deal with it in a more compassionate way is growing, and I'm glad for that.
I love the phrase, the way we do family in the United States. I'm sure when we get to the Q&A part, people will be picking up on that, right? So thank you, Ron. So as it's helpful to hear that, and as you've encountered those surprises, how have you adapted your research agenda and approaches in response to them?
Well, you know, one way is to look at the race ethnic variation in what I call vulnerable non-resident fathers, and to help to change my own thinking about this, to change the way I talk about this and write about this, so that people understand that this is quite a generic phenomena in the United States, and it has consequences for the general population, not only for the BIPOC conversation. I think that's very important. And also in terms of the way I look at sort of economic trends related. So I'll give you an example. In the last book that I published, which is called Failing Our Fathers, we did some quantitative and qualitative research on non-resident fathers. Our goal was to try to figure out how much they understood about the New York State non-resident father earned income tax credit. This was a new piece of legislation in New York that was going to try to provide work incentives to non-resident fathers in order that they could work longer and earn the money that they needed to support their children. And so we did interviews in tax preparation agencies all around New York City in order to understand how men who had children, what they knew about this, whether they intended to apply, etc. And what we were disappointed to find out was there are lots of less educated, low-skilled white men who work in New York, in the city, in Manhattan, and in the Brooklyn, etc., but they tended not to live there. So when we were doing our interviews in the tax preparation agencies, we came up with lots of Black and Latino men, but no white men, right? And it was like, I'm not going to write another book about only Black men now that I know what I know. So we went to Chautauqua, New York. This is Lucille Ball's hometown. I remember flying on this little rickety plane there so that we could do interviews with white men, young white men who had experienced radical changes in their economic circumstances. Their fathers were the employees in major wood and wood processing manufacturing in earlier decades. But that industry had been entirely wiped out because of foreign competition, right? And so now you have this large cohort of young white men who have no college degrees, and the high-paying jobs that their fathers had entirely disappeared. And they worked as low-skilled men in resorts, in cleaning and et cetera. But there was a lot of domestic violence, there was a lot of non-marital parenting, and there were lots of child support problems. And so it was as if you could take Bill Wilson's arguments about the decline in manufacturing employment and how it had affected Black and Latino men in the inner city. You ported that right over to Chautauqua, New York. And many of the manifestations of the loss of high paying and stable employment and the consequences that it has for Black and Latino men in the inner city, you could see those same things play out among these young white men in Chautauqua, New York. And it was fascinating, it was eye-opening. But what was interesting is that in many large cities, there were developing fatherhood programs who paid attention to this phenomenon because it affected so many families. And there was already a support structure beginning to develop to support these men to reconnect with their families, to deal with their child support problem. But that social infrastructure was not available in Chautauqua, New York. And I found that interesting. So in a way, I began to talk about this phenomena in a much more generic way, letting the data and trying to help my readers and policymakers understood that this is not just something that affects Black and Latino men, it's going to affect cohorts of men and their children for decades to come. And therefore, what's happening to Black and Latino men was really like a canary in the minefield, and we better pay attention to it more broadly.
Wow. It's a great example of that sort of looking in one area and finding connections in other areas and seeing things that folks didn't see before and trying to dislodge some really long-held beliefs that have been promoted, I suspect, quite actively. As the field has developed, Ron, how would you say, I know you've been very influential, how would you say your research has influenced the development of the field?
Well, when I was coming up for tenure, I kind of learned from Irv Garfinkel and others of my colleagues, and I was late in the game in the sense that my career is not the career of the typical academic. I worked in think tanks and in foundations before coming into academia. And so what I learned was the critical criteria for tenure was, not the number of papers that you published, but whether or not the field pivoted because of your work. And I think in the case of my work, I was fortunate that it absolutely did so. I can recall, I'm an economist by training. And when I sort of came up as an economist, it was unusual for economists, particularly at places like Harvard and MIT, to do work on small populations. I mean, we were concerned about context and major trends. I was privileged and challenged to, my classmates are two Nobel Prize winners, Paul Krugman and Ben Bernanke. They were in my class at MIT. And
class with you.
Yeah, it was. Tell me about it. And so it was. We were thinking about the larger economy, and it was unusual and actually not well respected for people to devote that kind of intellectual capital to problems of small populations. But given my background personally and how this phenomena had affected communities of color, I just I grew up with the notion of to him to whom much is given, much was expected. And therefore, I devoted my research to that. And I can recall in 2009, 2010, the Institute for Research on Poverty, one of the major intellectual gatherings of social scientists who study poverty problems, they devoted an entire conference to low-skilled men of color. That was a turning point. And then a couple of years later, in 2012, the Brookings Institute did a major policy piece on what is happening to low-income men and the child support. And I've had commissioners of the former commissioner of child support enforcement in New York jokingly said to me, Ron, you're a real pain, right? Because we're right-sizing child support orders because of your work. And so I've known from the way the intellectual community has begun to is now deeply interested in, there's a colleague of mine, his name is, I'm blanking on his name, at the Brookings Institute, who is a young dad himself, who's doing a lot of work on what's happening to young boys. And so that pivot, it was popular. One of my major mentors when I was coming through is Isabel Sawhill, who talked a lot about the way, the notion of the feminization of poverty. And in that, men who divorced mothers, they were the perpetrators, and women and children were the victims. I tried to tell a different story, and I think many are telling their own versions of that story with data now.
Well, that's got to be really rewarding and gratifying, especially given what started you down this path at the beginning. So congratulations on that. I like that description of 10 years being, have you made the field pivot? And it's making me think of Columbia's espousing of the fourth purpose, right? And really having impact in the world. So, okay, your research has influenced the field. How has your research affected the evolution of policy? So bringing that evidence and research to bear in real world situations.
Well, I think it's influenced in two ways that I observed. First of all, the notion of right-sizing child support orders. There was a case called Turner versus Rogers, in which it went all the way to the Supreme Court, where states are no longer allowed to set child support orders that ignore non-resident fathers' real observable ability to pay. That decision was made in 2011, and it is still working its way through the states. Wow. But the notion of right-sizing child support orders is the policy objective, and depending upon the administration, it is increasingly influencing the way. I've had conversations with directors of child support enforcement in Illinois, in New York, in Michigan, and elsewhere around the country, where they're wrestling with this notion of, it does us no good to set child support orders above the ability to pay, the consequence of which is that children don't get more money, mothers don't get any more money. What happens is there's an increasing level of arrears that will never be collected. And I've written papers with students at Columbia about on the growth of arrears. I wrote this paper that people still beat me up about. The title is called "Deadbeats and Turnips in Child Support Enforcement," i.e., you can't collect money from a turnip. But the idea is that, and so the child support enforcement community is now wrestling with this idea. It's also wrestling with the notion of structural racism in child support enforcement. There's a NIH grant on the announcement on the street to think about structural racism in child support enforcement and how it affects health. And I've applied for one of those grants, and we've not been successful yet. But again, that's one way concretely. I think the other way is this conversation around parenting time. And this is one of the things that my book discusses. So the long and short of it is that our child support enforcement visitation custody was all designed to facilitate the concerns of children of divorce and what happens when there is parental conflict. And over time, we first following the Rome and England and the colonies, custody in a divorce was given to the father. And we changed that standard to give custody to the mother. And then eventually we gave custody to according to the best interests of the child. And so whoever didn't get custody was responsible for paying child support, and so it went. However, as a consequence of the legal system having custody of divorced parents and their children, and the adverse consequences of divorce for children, the courts have also developed parent education programs that are designed to limit the conflict that parents experience, mitigate the amount of litigation, and to try to find ways not to expose children of divorce to the conflict that occurs. But none of that stuff applies to children who are born outside of marriage. So if you have a non-marital birth, now roughly 70% of children of color are born to unmarried parents, but in the United States writ large, about 40% of children are born outside of marriage. When your parents, when these cohabiting relationships break up, or if parents never lived together in the first place, there is a legal requirement to establish paternity. There's a legal requirement to establish a child support order, but there is no legal right without subsequent litigation to have visitation or any of that. Nor is there support for helping parents deal with the conflicts that arise as a consequence of the separation of a romantic relationship that's gone sour. And so while we're doing all these things to help children of divorce and their parents create the best possible circumstance to co-parent their children after a breakup, none of that is currently available for the children who are born outside of marriage, which is the predominant pathway to childbirth among people of color, African Americans particularly, and increasingly the pathway to childbirth for young whites as well. And therefore, this whole notion of parenting time, which grants a visitation order at the same time it requires a child support order for non-resident fathers, is something that is moving around the states, that they're experimenting with it, trying to figure out what would make it work, so that children who are born to unmarried parents and children who are born to married parents are placed on equal footing, not only with respect to child support, but also with respect to reducing the co-parent conflict and helping their parents do the best they can to provide together for the needs of their children, even after the romance is done. And so those are direct consequences of the work that we've done.
That's amazing. I hope you take great pride in that. Really important
and
changes.
there are a lot of people in it, and that's what's making it work.
Yeah, that's great. I'm, at the beginning, when I got to do the introduction of all the great work that you do, I mentioned that you received your PhD from MIT. MIT is not a social work school. How has your affiliation with the Columbia School of Social Work contributed to the development of your research, would you say?
Well, in many ways. First of all, I got to work with first-class academicians who had worked in the area of child support. My 18-year-old passion, Irv Garfinkel was a leader in the field long before I got there. Sarah McClanahan, his wife, who's recently passed away, a dear friend, a mentor, an expert in the sociology of parenting, couples, etc. Jeannie Brooks Gunn, and my colleagues around child development. I approached all this work from the vantage point of fathers, but at some juncture I had to learn about child development. And so the ability to work with these stellar colleagues, who some of whom Irv is both an economist and a social worker, so he was a good person to talk to, and their students who then became my students. So the ability to work in an interdisciplinary environment was really, really very important to my work, because it bled out of the economics of the family to these other considerations about which I had no training whatsoever. I think the other way is it gave me a language for certain things that were that economists never thought about, but that are important to think about the issues, in my own work and for the families that my work deals with. This whole conversation around identity has been fascinating. How people can this notion of intersectionality, how people can occupy different ways in which they define themselves in multiple ways. This is a language that and importantly, the notion of social justice. Economists worry about efficiency. That's the top of their thing. They worry about individual the rights, or we are concerned about the ability of people to achieve the best that they can to maximize their utility or to maximize their profit. And notions of social justice, get buried in the conversation. And so my work is fundamentally about social justice. And therefore, working with colleagues at Columbia gave me put some new thoughts in my head, and I had to learn about them better and see how they apply to the decisions that policymakers were making around low-income men and their families and their children. So it's been a great ride.
For sure, that social justice theme is coming through loud and clear, I think, in everything you said so far tonight. So thank you. I was also hearing a story from Lenara a little while ago. At the risk of embarrassing you, she'd encountered an alum of the business school here at Columbia who took one course with you, and she reported that was the single best course she'd taken at Columbia. So I'm thinking about teaching. How have you been able to incorporate your research into your teaching?
Well, at the front part of my career at Columbia, I taught a course in social. I taught the social welfare policy course, and it had I worked in the Clinton administration and witnessed firsthand the evolution of the Clinton administration's welfare reform and child support reform policies, and I carried that experience over into my classroom and was able to talk a great deal about how policy is really framed. And, I think that social workers, because social workers are trained in human development, economists think a lot about the incentives that policymakers try to tweak in policies in order to manipulate people. I mean, that's what we do. We worry about how decisions and the constraints that people make influence their behavior, and we try to design social welfare policy to influence the way people make choices about things. But for good or ill, economists have a very strong influence over social policy. We just do. However, I think that social workers, because they have a lens on human development, they understand the way in which sometimes people simply reject the incentives that are built into social welfare policies in a way economists don't. And so what I try to do in my classroom is to I try to steal clinicians from clinical work over into policy work, because I argue that if you can learn the language of economics so that you can have a respectful conversation with economists and policy wonks, you're able to influence the way policies are designed, because you understand how people are going to respond to these incentives in a way that, because of the way economists and policy wonks are trained, they may not really understand. And so the way I taught my microeconomics courses and my social welfare policy courses were at that. And I've managed to steal some clinicians away, and they've begun to think about the role that they could play in administering the social welfare programs as they come up through the ranks, and the way in which they could become involved in social policy. And I'm sort of proud of that.
Yes, you should be. I think without doubt. I just want to echo what Jen has put in the chat. If you have questions, I have a ton more. So, but if you have questions from our audience, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll pick up on those. But let me go back to some of what I've been thinking about. Ron, I'm a big believer in the power of interdisciplinary research, and so I'm just wondering about how your research agenda at CSSW has blended, and to what degree it has blended with the research of other CSSW faculty and students. Has there been a lot of that?
There's not been a lot, but it's first of all, it's a character trait. My training as an economist, economists walk in arrogance. I don't know why it is so, but that's what we do. It's not my nature, but it's the nature of my field. And I have found working with sociologists and working with people who are interested in child development, they do, particularly their empirical work, quite differently. Also, working with people like Nabila El-Basso and thinking about intervention research. These are areas of work that, again, I had very little training in, but I began to see the value of the kinds of work that they did, and had to, when I, particularly in the book that I'm working on now with my colleague at the University of Maryland, I had to learn how psychologists think about empirical work. Economists are accustomed to interviewing people, collecting observational data, and then using quite sophisticated techniques in order to make causal inferences about the cause of certain outcomes, and we're not interested in estimating associations between variables. We only want to know what is the cause and what is the effect. People who do intervention research do it quite differently. They use structural equation models, and lots of economists think that's voodoo science, right? But I want to sit down with someone who understands child development. These people are psychologists. They do structural equation models, and I had to humble myself and say, look, I'm going to take off all the blinders of my discipline and try to come to grips with how psychologists think about the direct and indirect effects of fathers' monetary contributions to children, the time they spend with children, and learn what that stuff was all about in order to write this book with my colleague, because she's the one who knows about child development. I'm the one who knows about child support enforcement policy. And if we were going to get this project done, I had to defer to her. So that's one example. I also became quite fascinated with intervention research. And if I had it to do over again, I would, have made a bigger investment in it. Because oddly, the programs, the interventions that we do in child support enforcement policy are driven by policymakers' interests, right? They are not theory-based. They are not Congress. The child support enforcement program is funded in part by states, but 2/3 of the money comes from the federal government. And so Congress expresses what it's interested in learning about child support, and the federal government wags its tail and the states jump because that's the way they get the money from. On the other hand, in areas like mental health, substance abuse, interpartner violence, all sorts of areas that are important to people, intervention researchers who do theory-based models, who then use structural equation models to understand the pathways through which certain decisions lead to outcomes, and then they do that empirical research in order to figure out what are the distal and proximate outcomes, and they then go out and test these models, and then they have to deal with real people, right? In economics we call the verisimilitudes of people, we call it white noise, and we try to figure out fancy statistical techniques to control the white noise. When you're doing intervention research, you have to deal with real people, and they have, and you can't take their white noise for granted. And so, but increasingly, I had one opportunity. It's like I could taste it in around 2012, I think it was. I was working with NIH. I was trying to get them to pivot and to support, from the behavioral level, the development of a fatherhood intervention. And I got that close, but we were in sequestration. And the money wasn't there. And I was working within NIH trying to persuade their program staff to do this and making progress and making headway. But sequestration took the money away, the opportunity went, and there it was. So, but I certainly have learned a lot from, and had students who work with Nabila and are now out in the field making a difference using the skills that they learned. And so I'm gratified that that I've influenced their work in some way.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you've given us a little insight too, that we all face these major obstacles and you just gotta keep
You gotta,
going,
you gotta
find
keep
another
going.
way, find another
Find a
way.
way.
Yeah. So we haven't talked about your new, well, you've been talking about what's going into your new book. When is the new book coming out, Ron?
So I'm trying to knock out the draft by December,
Okay.
and then we'll go through a second set of reviews, and hopefully it'll be out next year. So, and it's all about thinking about, we're using the data that we created in Fragile Families, which is the first major longitudinal study of mothers and fathers, looking at the how parental circumstances influence the well-being of children. From birth, we are now collecting data when these children are 22 years old. Our study, Money and More, looks at them between birth and 9 years old. And what it's really about is, what is the impact of the financial contributions that fathers make that fathers resident and non-resident make to children, and what is the impact of the other ways in which they contribute to child well-being, including the time they spend reading to children, and the like. And what we're really trying to make the case is, if you look at the amount of money that many non-resident fathers are capable of paying, as the data supports, it's not so clear that the best ways to improve child well-being is to go hard on child support and spend billions of dollars trying to squeeze blood out of a turnip. However, if you took some of that money and invested it in helping fathers help their children learn how to read, how to recognize characters, their social emotional development, that ultimately the outcomes for children might be better than if we spend all this time trying to get them to pay amounts of money that they're simply incapable of doing. And so we're trying to make that argument using the data that we have, and also a plethora of research that's been done using Fragile Families data and other data as well. And the kicker has been, I became a granddad for the third time, and all these things
Congratulations.
in the last couple of 3 years. My grandson is now 5 years old, and all these things about child development. I'm getting to see aha moments in his development with my son and daughter, and in my interaction with him, and it's fascinating, to reparent all over again. But it also helps me to understand that young men, particularly if they're not living with their children during the first 5 years, they are missing opportunities to contribute to their development that are priceless. And it sort of takes me back to this redemption idea.
It's wonderful how you're tying this to your own life, and finding the motivation there. Thank you for sharing that with us. So we're getting some great questions flowing in. So I want to turn to those. I'm going to start with this one. Someone has asked, how do you help those with this intergenerational poverty to have financial independence? Are there particular strategies that work and strategies that don't? You've alluded to that a little bit a moment ago about not running after people who can't possibly provide the level of support that is needed. But how would you answer that question?
Well, I have a colleague and one of my former grantees who runs a fatherhood program in Baltimore, and it's at the Center for Fathers, Children, and the Center for Fathers and Workforce Development. I'm blanking on the name of the organization.
Sure.
And what he's done is, so he works with low-income men in Baltimore, which is, a level where there are high levels of crime, very high levels of unemployment, substance abuse is rampant in this area of Baltimore. And what he's done is he's created this initiative in which he teaches the fathers that he works with financial literacy. And he works with them around, first of all, getting jobs, particularly in niche industries where they, for example, learn to do construction work, a skill that they can easily manage. He's helping them to get jobs in the construction of low-income housing, and then to become homeowners themselves so that they can transfer that equity to their children as they move along. But he's also working along the lines of becoming what we might think of as intermediaries, perhaps a better word is navigators in the child support enforcement system. Because what's really, really clear is if low-income men begin to accumulate high levels of arrears that they will never be able to pay, it destroys their own financial future, but it also prevents them from passing on a legacy to their children. And one of the real challenges here, and then we get into very complicated areas. One of the most important reasons why men, particularly men of color, have really high levels of child support arrears is because they have children by multiple partners. And so they have child support orders to 2 or more households. And as a result, they will make their child support enforce their child support orders, but it's child support that distributes the amounts that they pay to one family and another family and another family. And therefore, they can pay child support and still be in arrears because they have to allocate their income across multiple families. And so one of the things that child support enforcement is doing is trying to work with younger men, trying to bring them into the child support enforcement system earlier before before the situation becomes difficult to manage. And my own view of this is that it should have an implication not only for their employment, but also for their fertility, right? If you have multiple child support orders to multiple children, you will never be able to pay those orders. And as a result, you will be in arrears, and your ability to save and pass on a home or income to educate, to partially support your children's college education, you're wiping that out immediately if by the age of 24, you have 3 children by 3 different partners, right? And so we're going to that hard and difficult place about being responsible in your sexuality, something that I'm not afraid of dealing with, in order to make sure that you have a legacy, including a financial legacy, to pass on to your children. And then thinking about what financial literacy is all about, how to save money, how to invest money, and the like. So these are things that have bubbled up in the field and that we're working with in community-based organizations all across the country, which is work that I've been doing, from my days at the Ford Foundation, and continue to do as an academic.
Really challenging questions there.
Yes.
Thank you, Ron. Some terrific questions are coming, and we're not going to have time to get through all of them, but let's try to do a couple more.
Sure.
So one viewer asked, what advice do you have for aspiring lawyer economists, those interested in shaping the law from an economic framework, and specifically the foregone opportunity costs of free or cheap penal labor from Black men and Black communities impacted by displaced labor?
Well, I think this whole area of incarceration is one of the most important areas that's occurring throughout many different disciplines, including economics. So there are, economists have done research on what we call the scarring effects of incarceration. The fact that once incarcerated, and we can see this in the Fragile Families data, once incarcerated, the parole system is really designed to make it very difficult to get out of the criminal justice system. Absolutely. And as a result, the long-term impacts on men's earnings and women's earnings increasingly are very, 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 very deleterious. And so thinking about the carceral costs of incarceration is an area of lots of work in economics, and that work is influencing what other fields are doing in the area. I will say myself, when I was 24 years old, my wife and I used to do a prison ministry. We were in Boston. We went to Walpole Prison every week to do a Bible study with people who were incarcerated. And this is the prison that one of the prisons that our colleague at Columbia has worked in as well. He wrote this important book that came out in the last few years. And our work there was very interesting. We interacted with the prisoners who came to the Bible study. But one day they invited us to a talent show. And we got to go into the general population when I saw hundreds of Black and Latino men who looked like the young men in my neighborhood. And it simply broke my heart. At the tender age of 24, I just couldn't stomach it. And it's an area that I just didn't have the emotional maturity to stay in. And I pivoted and went to deal with the child support work. Now, I'm so pleased about the work that people like Michelle Alexander, Bruce Western, and others are doing in incarceration. There's my colleague,
Miller,
Amanda Geller, and former student at Columbia, who is a real leader in work around incarceration. My former student who's now at Rutgers University is doing work around incarceration and the collateral consequences for incarceration and child support. And so while I didn't have the courage or maturity to stay in that area, many of my students and colleagues have.
Yeah, we all make choices, and certainly can't complain about yours, Ron. Another question has come in. I think this picks up on the how we do family phrase that you used earlier. Can you talk more? You've touched on this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about the consequences of our current approach to child support with the general public, and what you see as key interventions needed to strengthen so-called fragile families?
Well, so I've taken some heat around the term fragile families. You know, when I was growing up, if you got a box from whatever was Amazon at the time, and the article was a delicate one, there would be a big red strip across it, and it would say "fragile, handle with care." And that's what I meant.
I can picture it. Yeah.
You know, you're right. So, and occasionally you'll get one now. It certainly was not meant to cast any aspersions on low-income parents. It was meant to say essentially that when you know, much of this work arose among long-term welfare recipients and the fathers of their children. These are young people who have children before they graduate from high school, before they have a lot of work experience, and before they have the emotional maturity to handle a long-term relationship. They have children without thinking about what that childbirth is going to, and often the birth of the child itself is the time in which they begin to process, what does it mean now that we've had this child? And it really changes the trajectory, certainly of the mother, but of the father as well. And so what my work has tried to do is to try to get policymakers and child support administrators to understand that the procedures that they take to enforce child support for people who have finished high school, finished college, they were mature enough to get married in the first place. They maintained a relationship for several years, and then there was a divorce or separation. The procedures that they used to set and enforce child support orders with respect to them will not work for the population that I was describing, who have increasingly become a larger and larger portion of our cash assistance, child support, earned income tax credit. Many of the policies that we use to reduce poverty are increasingly populated by non-marital parents who have their children when they're very, very young. And so what I've tried to do is really create, get them to think about, and this is crazy, but radical, what means-tested child support enforcement policy would be. That is to say, how do you set and enforce child support orders that accommodate people's ability to pay, and also accommodate the fact that they are very likely to have their children outside of marriage, and as a result, the relationships between the parents, their own maturity is going to be quite different than the people for whom the child support system had in the back of their mind when they created that situation. And there was also the development of the child support enforcement system has been infused by advocacy on the part of women's groups on the one hand and fathers' rights groups on the other. These were well-organized organizations and systems that influence the courts and influence policy. There's nothing like that, nothing whatsoever, in terms of the advocacy on behalf of low-income mothers and fathers and their children. And in many ways, that's contributed to how long it has taken to get policymakers to pay attention to what's going on.
Oh, amazing. So we're down to our last couple of minutes here, Ron. I've heard from two alums, one who says, your economics courses were my favorite at CSSW, and they use their knowledge from your courses to enhance their understanding of people's experiences on a daily basis. So kudos to you again. And another alum who regrets that they didn't have a chance to take courses with you. And they ask, have you considered the experience of the Jewish immigrant generations who lived as you did, with monumental secrets about parentage, absent fathers, etc.? So just wondering about any correlations there.
You know, I haven't, you know, reflected on that contemporary experience, although, you know, my own studies of the scriptures give me some insight into what's that's about. And my wife was a former, she spent a lot of time in the New York City Housing Authority, working with families of all race, ethnicities, and this issue of the size and complexity of Jewish families, the special accommodations that had to be made for them in public housing, you know, arose for her. And the course that she now offers at Columbia on it's called Fathers, Families, and Social Welfare Policy, sort of delves into that complexity. But it's not been part of my own work. And I should perhaps take a look. And again, what I'm interested in is how this proliferates across cultures, right?
Yeah.
And race and ethnicities, and that would be an interesting variation on the theme as well. So
yeah, there have to be echoes and
Yep.
things we could learn. Yeah, that's amazing. Amazing. So I can't believe we're up to time already. I've got a dozen more questions, but I'm going to have to sit on them. I'm so glad that we've recorded this session, Ron, so that others can hear it. And it's just been an absolute delight chatting with you, talking about your career, your contributions, and your impact. And I'm even more impressed than I was before. And just the way you've threaded your personal experiences through it in a very forthright way. It's been very special. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you again for. I just enjoy working with you. Enjoy your leadership, and we're in a good place.
Thank you, Ron. Keep up the fantastic work, and we'll publicize as soon as the book comes out. So folks, stay tuned, and we'll make sure everybody gets that information. But anyway, I just want to again thank Ron, thank everybody for joining you. Best wishes to everybody over the holidays and beyond. So take care, everybody.
Okay.